Started. Hope you had a good evening and Christmas celebrations went on yesterday till late in the night, I presume. So we have Professor Anjan Mukherjee. He's a professor emeritus in JNU and is a master of general equilibrium theory. He's a great exponent as well as a great contribution. He has made great contributions to general equilibrium theory, and we are really grateful to him for agreeing to come and give talks in this winter school. He's also a visiting professor in the NIPFP, National Institute for Public Finance and Policy, and he's also a country director in the ICG program, India Bihar program. So he's been very active in this field for a long time, and particularly in the context of financial crisis as well. He's been writing a lot on financial crisis, and as you can see, the microeconomics of market failure, trying to understand what's going on around us. So we are very, very grateful to Professor Anjan Mukherjee, and I hope you'll enjoy these lectures and find it very useful. There's a reading material that he has given us, so I'm going to put it up as a hard copies. Xerox copies will be available outside after the lecture. Okay, so we have 2 lectures today from him, and then afternoon we have Professor Srikanth here will do the first mathematical preliminaries. Okay. All right, so similar rule applies that absolutely burning questions, ask. If you have more broader questions, hold it off and we can do it in the review and discussion. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Raghav, for that introduction. It's a privilege to be here at this new campus. And as I said, that when I heard that I was going to be lecturing in a hall which is named after Ramanujam, I had the feeling of running away. Because Ramanujam, of course, brings back all kinds of memories about what a great mathematician he was and how we are sort of unfit to follow. Anyway, what I'm going to be talking about is microeconomics of market failures. I consider market failure is a misnomer because of the way market behaves. If you look at today's Hindustan Times, for example, what do you read? You read that in Delhi, front page, first news on the left is about what's happening in Delhi. You may have heard that in Delhi they're going to adopt this odd-even business of running cars, right? So now there are, in the market, you can buy stickers which would change the last digit of your car, duplicate number plates, all for a price. Now, so the market has evolved. Right? So the market works. The problem is that the market works in undesirable ways. And the question then is, why does it do so? Right? And I hope to be able to give you in 4 lectures some inkling as to why the market may behave the way it does. There are many examples of so-called market failures that we will see as we go along. Now, I have write-up. Now, I believe this is a rather non-homogeneous group, so people with different backgrounds, people with no background in economics, a lot of background in economics, no background in maths, a lot of background in maths, and all so on. So there is something for everything, and I tried to do that. So first is you got to know some economics, because that's what I'm going to be talking about. And this is a simple book, and this is a standard book that you need to read. That was very quick. It doesn't do it gradually, does it? Okay. Then For those with a background in economics and some mathematics, this is where I blow my own trumpet a little bit. My own book. There are many other books. I'm not saying that's the only one. And then, of course, at the same time, I've put down Arrow and Hans, a classic book, and of course, Microeconomic Analysis, the higher version of variance book. All right, so there are these. And those with an adequate background in economics and mathematics, I believe there are some. Then what you ought to be reading is the classic Theory of Value by Gerard Debreu. And Mas-Colellet and Jerry Green's and someone else, Microeconomic Theory book, and I mentioned the chapters. Now, basically, there are two articles on which I shall confine attention. One is my own, which I have just finished. Says 2016, which means it hasn't come out as yet. Well, it's just come out, okay? And the other is a lecture by Arrow. Now, both of these things you'd be having access to. Now, there's also another class of readings that you should look at, and that is about popular readings about markets and so on. Why? Because they give you a lot of examples, right? There are many, many such books. There are people like Sachs and Stiglitz who have written, but I have not chosen them because they are economists mainly. So I have chosen a couple of books which are by journalists basically, but economic journalists. The book by Cassidy, which is How Markets Fail, it's rather well written. And then this Rickard's book, The Death of Money, which is also very well written. And finally, there is a book which I like, The Economics of Financial Markets. I thought I should mention something about finance because this is about a course in finance. And you will find that this is an excellent book where all the different terms that financial people talk about are explained by two of the classic economists, Houthacker and Williamson. This is a slightly older book, but I think it's well worth looking into. You come across a term which you have not heard before, then please look into this and you'll find a definition and an explanation at that. Okay? All right, I think we can shut this off and we can proceed, right?
Leave it there.
Oh, leave it there. Okay, fine. Now, what we are going to be talking about is, as I said, market failures. But more specifically, microeconomics is contrast. I believe you've had Professor Bhaduri for macro. So you need to know what is it that you're doing which is distinct from macro. If you look at any textbook in economics, you'll find a definition which I don't think is particularly apt. The definition is that macro is about aggregate and micro is about individual decision-making units. It's not apt because you often talk about aggregate demand curves. Is that macro? That's not macro. So what is it that would make it macro? What would make it macro is if you build in time into the system. In other words, when you're looking at a future, if you're looking at the future, then you must be looking at uncertainty. If you build in to microeconomics time and uncertainty into it, then there's not really that much of difference between micro and macro. Because you'll be talking about savings, you trade-off is between consuming today or consuming tomorrow, so you save. The firm invests today to produce tomorrow. So all these decisions come into play, and therefore you start talking about important macroeconomic variables. So let's, for the time being, let me not bring in time or uncertainty, all right? So we are in a static world. It's just today, decision making happens today, and you look at a decision maker. Let me make things as general as possible, and I'll try to put down before you one rule, which if you remember, then you can apply it to many, many situations and always get the implication thereof. Think of a decision maker who has to choose some action. So what does his decision consist of? Choose an action. What action? Well, he has only, or she has only, a set of things available from the field that he can choose. So is that large enough? Can you see it? So that is the set of actions. And little a is an action which is feasible or which is permissible for the decision maker. So it's just a question of choosing. Now, as soon as there is a choice, you have to ask, how does the fellow choose? Or indeed, why does he choose? Well, obviously, he chooses because choosing this action gives him certain benefits, which I can say depend on the action chosen. And if there are only benefits, then there is not much of a choice because you do it in any case. But what makes the thing a difficult problem is because there are costs. Now, so the net benefit is basically something like this. And the person chooses, obviously, that action where this benefit minus cost is the largest, all right? Now, everything in economics is in terms of this, right? The difficulty is, how do you measure benefits? How do you measure costs? What are costs? Now, as soon as you start giving some background to the measuring of benefits and costs, you have the richness of the results turning out, okay? Now, what I'll try to do is give you examples, and then we shall build up on the basis of that, right? Now, you see, as soon as I put some structure here, suppose I say that this benefits is a function of A, single valued, that it is continuous, so is C a continuous function. Suppose I put some structure on it, say that not only is it continuous but differentiable too. Suppose I say that, well, this A is some kind of a compact set in an appropriate topology, right? Then, of course, continuous functions over compact sets attain a maximum, and you know the problem can be solved. If it is differentiable, then you can get first order conditions and so on and so forth, right? But that need not be the case. You see, the problem with economics has been that we often quickly assume that things have become Oh, so I have already, yeah. We go till 11, right? Yeah. All right. So there would be some conditions under which this choice would exist that we can pin it down and proceed. All right. The problem with economics has been that we have always assumed the structure very quickly and proceeded on that basis. Right. Now, often the structure is not there for you to assume. You are already restricting a wide range of problems. So what I'd like to do is to keep it like so and then apply to some particular cases. Now, there are two classes of phenomena in which I would like to emphasize. Both begin with I. Now, these were not there in classical economics as we studied. May have been there. People didn't talk about it. One was the problem of information, and the other is the problem of incentive. Now, as you shall see, as I hope you will see, that it is these two together which create problems for the markets to work, right? Now, we are going to be looking at decision makers who are small in some sense. That is, they small in the sense that they are not big enough to control the market. Now, why are we looking at such people? Well, I'll answer that question a bit later. So, permit me to make this choice. Think of a firm or a producer who buys inputs, produces outputs, and sells it in the market. So, what is a producer's role or a firm's role? Buy inputs, has access to a technology, so basically uses these inputs to form certain a particular output and sells it. Now, sells it at what price? He's small, so he can't control the price. Whatever the market price he observes, he takes that as given. So let's say the kth producer producing the kth output at a price pk per unit. And so if he sells qk, then that is his revenue. But then he has to produce the qk, so that's the cost. And so you have, again, that benefit minus costs set up. You have the revenue are the benefits, the costs are the costs associated. Now, there is a rich theory of what cost curves look like, how do costs behave. I wouldn't have time to get into all of this, all right? So let's assume that the costs are the costs which the firm has to bear to produce this output, and it's well defined, and it behaves in a particular way. You would expect that if you want to produce more, it would cost more, and so on. Now, if the firm were to maximize this, right, what output level should it decide? So that's the action. So it would maximize this difference. Now, if you want to maximize this, this is a very straightforward functional form. So we can easily use the derivatives and we can come up with pk. You differentiate this with respect to q. So pk is equal to c prime qk. This is the first order condition. And of course, that c double prime qk should be negative. So you have the well-known condition that price should equal marginal cost, and that is the profit maximizing condition for a small firm or a competitive firm. All right? Think about another type of people who participate, people who buy. So this is the fellows who bring to the market something to sell, right? So think of individuals, households. What do they have to trade with? They have some resources, their labor to sell in the market. They may have some land, all kinds of things which firms may want as inputs, right? So they bring to the market whatever skills they have, sell it. With that, they purchase other goods, all right? Now things become slightly more difficult. Why do they wish to buy goods? You traditionally argue that, well, I mean, it gives them some satisfaction to consume goods. Instead of doing that, think of the alternative sets of baskets of consumption goods that a person could consume. So there may be many. Should be able to rank. Suppose there are two alternatives. Which do I like, this one or that one? Or do I find them, well, about the same? I should be able to say that. So to proceed formally, I'll give you something which goes back to Debreu's theory of value. This is a classic Debreu result, that under certain conditions, the ranking that people have can be represented. And this is a very, very straightforward argument. And I thought maybe just to show that there are things that one can do with kinds of arguments that we talk about, let me talk about them. So the individuals can rank various alternatives. So let's say that I talk of alternatives as, I don't know, let's say I'll be drawing diagrams basically. I won't be giving you the general proof. So let's say there are two goods. And the person is considering what are the person's ranking over various bundles. So for instance, let's say notation, I don't think I can do this. So let me stick, let's say that is X and Y are the two goods. Move a little, yeah, that, or maybe. You don't need this for this hour? No, I don't. Okay. Yeah, yeah, you can push it up. Just shut it also. Okay. And of course, so what I'm doing is confining attention to quantities of the two goods as being the alternatives that are open to the individual. So let's say this and that. Should he be able to compare these two? Now, if he's able to compare these two, then we are thinking in terms of a binary relation being defined on that set. And we want the following. So this is binary relation. Which satisfies these following properties: completeness, oh. No, that's fine. Okay. So we have, what is completeness? Take any two bundles, and it should be the case that either this happens or that happens, or both happen. That is, this R can be read as at least as good as. So you say that the bundle x1, y1 is at least as good as x2, y2, or the other way around, or both, in which case there's some indifference. Reflexivity is a technical restriction which just says that every bundle is as good as itself. And transitivity is, you'd have to define three bundles, at least over triples. If you have this, then this must imply now these are common restrictions. I'm not saying that these are required, but these are easy restrictions. I myself have worked on things where you have none of these things, and you can still proceed, but then it becomes technically very demanding to proceed. But it can be done. Transitivity, to which we add the de Broglie axiom. He called it continuity. What did he mean? He said that any bundle x, y, or let's say x bar, y bar, consider the set of all x, y so all x, y all xy such that xy is at least as good as x bar, y bar, that is a subset of R2, and that is closed. Closed means what? There must be people who don't know what's closed in this room, right? Closed is topologically closed. It means that the limit points of the set must be inside the set, right? So limit points are what? What is a limit point? What is a limit point? Limit point is any point is a limit point of a set if any neighborhood of the limit point contains another point of the set, right? Okay, so points of accumulation or limit points, one and the same. right? So this is closed for every and that is also closed for every, so this applies to both. So what does this mean? It means all those xy's which are at least as good as x bar, y bar, that's a closed set. And here, all those xy's such that x bar, y bar is at least as good as xy, that too is closed. All right? This is the assumption that is being imposed. Okay? I'm not, you can't prove them because immediately. Yeah. So apart from completeness, reflexivity, and transitivity, continuity means these two. All right? I can immediately give you an example where this doesn't happen. The best is to proceed like that. Think of a lexicographic ordering. What is a lexicographic ordering? It's an ordering in the dictionary. All right? Now, let that be an exercise. You try to work out why the lexicographic ordering for two goods does not satisfy continuity. Right? It's a perfectly acceptable kind of thing, right? What I'm going to show now is what De Breu showed, slightly weaker version because I'm going to be drawing diagrams. I'm going to also assume monotone. Monotone means what? Means if you have more is better. So given this bundle, everything here is better than that bundle, is at least as good, certainly. All right, so now what is the import of this? If all these assumptions hold, then there is a function u defined on xy such that it reflects this ranking. So if x1, y1 is r, x2, y2, then u associated with this would be larger than the u associated with it. All right? So this u can then be thought of as something that is called an utility function. So you don't need to start with the utility function. You can start with an ordering. Notice that the ordering is a very natural thing if you want people to, compare things and choose. How can you choose if you can't compare, right? So you compare, and then if that comparison satisfies this, then you can number them, okay? So let's say we choose some x bar, y bar, and give me a number, 10. Very good. So we define that u x bar, y bar is 10. The organizers have said that it shall be 10, and so it will be. All right? Now the question is, how do we get a u for all the others? It's very easy. And that is the hallmark of a great result. Once it's pointed out, everyone says, oh, of course. But then it has to occur to you first, right? So what you do is take any other xy, and we have to associate a number with it. All right? So what do? Now that's supposed to be a straight line through the origin, okay? So assume it's straight. Let that be x tilde, y tilde, okay? Now, what do we know about every point on that straight line through the origin? Notice that every straight line on that has coordinates of this type, where alpha varies between 0, 0 would get you here, 1 would get you there, and alpha greater than 1 would get you further along, all right? All right, now notice another thing. If you were to go far off, then that point on that ray, which is above the blackboard, would certainly be at least as good as this x bar, y bar by monotonicity, because it has more of some goods. Similarly, if you were to come below here, notice x bar, y bar would be at least as good as that, right? So by varying alpha, we can look at these two sets. These are sets of real numbers. They are non-empty, and therefore there is a classic property of sets of real numbers which are non-empty. They have a supremum and an infimum, both of them. So think of the infimum here and think of the supremum there. Now, again, let me give this as an exercise which you can, it's very easy, to show that that infimum and this supremum must be the same. That is, there can't be a range, because suppose they were not the same, then there would be an alpha which is outside the set and outside that set. And that means it's not comparable, and that, of course, violates completeness. So that, in fact, gets you an alpha which lies on the boundary of both the sets, and that alpha is the number you associate with ux bar, y bar. And as soon as you do that, you've done it for every. So it's a very simple, you have to do this, and I have to hurry through because there are other things that I have to talk about. But this is a De Breu 1954. It's out in the, it's in the theory of value, which you can look at. Proof would not be like this, of course, but essentially that. So we're talking about how the household chooses. So let's assume that the household has some ranking, which we can use a continuous function over the set of bundles that it can afford. So think of 2 bundles, so 2 goods. So if he has an income of M, so P1 X1 plus P2 X2 or Y1 less than equal to M, all X1, Y1s such as this is the affordable bundles, and that is determined by the prices and whatever income he has. Now this income needs some definition, because the income depends on whatever the person can sell, his labor, his land, any other skill that he may have, any other goods, okay? So that would get determined by whatever prices are. Remember, this is a small guy who takes all the prices as given, so chooses them, and then that is what you do. So you choose the highest U value here, And then that will be, if you look at well-behaved individuals, then their ISO U curves would be something like this, and you'd get some point like that. And notice that what you would get is that P1 by P2 should be equal to U1 by U2. Now this is for, these are partial derivatives. I should be careful. Okay, so the ratio of partial derivatives of the U function should reflect the price ratio. This is a classic condition for individuals' maximization. Now, this is for one person. Now, think of similar many more persons. They're also maximizing their own ranking, but they face the same prices. So their ratios of marginal utilities at an equilibrium of some kind would be the same. See, equilibrium would mean that everyone's demand and the firm's supply, they match. So that is equilibrium. So by doing this, you have the demand for the individual coming out. By doing that, you have the supplies of the firms coming out, and somehow they should match. If there were some prices at which this happens, then that would be an equilibrium or a competitive equilibrium. Now the problem is this, there's such a configuration of prices. Again, in the 1950s, there's three articles which came out. In fact, they were presented at the same meetings of the Econometric Society, which proved that there would always be, under some very general conditions, that there would be prices at which demands and supply match. One was a joint paper by Arrow and Debrow, and the other was a paper by Lionel Mackenzie. All right? So that is a competitive equilibrium. It's a thing or a structure where individuals get to do their best possible thing and firms get to do their best possible thing. So everyone gets to do their best possible thing. And everyone working completely in isolation. So looking at complete self-interest. All right? And together with this, we have the other thing, which is the ideal. This is not through markets. It is through consideration of what would be an efficient state for the entire economy. So remember, I'm going to be using these conditions that for firms, price equals marginal cost at equilibrium, and for individuals, the ratio of marginal utilities are going to reflect relative prices. All right? This I'm going to be using. So now let's just erase this and look at this. And suppose I'm asked that what would be an efficient distribution of things? How do you distribute? After all, because look at the question that we are trying to answer. Individuals and firms have technology, they are owned by individuals, they have shares in them, they want to do some things, but they are all small firms. They are not big firms which dictate prices. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't get you. They may not capture. Sorry? Yeah, you have to speak up. I have a problem.
Yeah. So we have this condition of monotonicity, and we are saying more is better, meaning thereby is the set which has more has higher utility for that individual, right? Now, after certain threshold, the utility, the individual might not derive any more.
Yeah, no, monotonicity is just for my, it's not essential.
It's not essential.
It's not essential. Yeah, I'll get diarrhea if I eat too much. So I know that. So that's not essential.
Like some kind of a Gaussian function. Then
yeah, I have drawn the classic textbook version. So it could be some other way, but it would be some kind of see, it is easy for me to talk if I have the textbook thing. I can immediately fix it if I don't have the textbook thing. But then I'll have to make so many, it's a corner maxima and this and that. So that, just allow me that liberty, okay? Allow me the liberty to say that whatever you read in textbook is about what you get. But the same thing happens. Similar things happen. Let me put it like this. Is that clear? Right. So now we come to efficiency. I mean, there isn't time, but the reason why people worried about this notion of a competitive equilibrium is what comes out next. See, think of a way of distributing all the goods and services that you have amongst all the participants. So suppose, you know, the economy consists of only people in this room. We have certain factors. Some of us are producing things. Some of us are just consuming. Some of us are doing both. All kinds of things. And we decide how we are going to split up all our resources. One way of doing it is that you elect a leader amongst, and let's say he is elected, and he says, now let me see, this is what we have, this is what we can produce, this is what you all get, and it distributes. When would that be called efficient? It will be called efficient if there is no other way of redistributing feasible things which would make someone better off and leave no one worse off. Now, this is a tricky definition, all right? For instance, think of the very simple thing, I have a lakh of rupees, good, which I have to distribute amongst all of you. What is one possible distribution? I keep it with myself and say, sorry, nothing for you. Right? That's what I'd like, of course. The other could be that, well, I'm in a new place and I have to put up some appearance, so I'll say, okay, everyone gets an equal share. And suppose he is the boss and he says, no, none of this, I keep everything. Which one is efficient? The problem is all of them are efficient. You cannot use efficiency to distinguish between what is morally right and what is morally wrong, or not so. In fact, I read somewhere saying that a perfectly disgusting state can also be efficient. So, that's it. However, what does it mean, therefore? It means that there is no wastage. If there is some wastage, then you could immediately write it, produce some more, and give it to anyone, and no one is worse off and someone is better off. Right? But even no wastage is a damn good thing. Right? So, the competitive equilibrium that I described a few minutes ago achieves that. Right? That there is no wastage. In fact, that result is being given a name. It's called the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics. Right? And the entire discussion of market failure is if the markets fail to get you efficiency. Right? So I was trying my level best to hurry to where I get to this stage, and then I'll try talking about how we can proceed. But one other thing, I've just asserted that the first fundamental theorem. Let me give you a geometric proof of it, because that would also convey something instead of assertion. You might not go back and say there was this old man who came and said all kinds of crazy things and went away, right? So at least I'll draw some diagrams. So think about efficiency, all right? And think again in terms of two goods, because I can only draw diagrams on the blackboard. My three-dimensional diagrams are not very good, and they're not very revealing, as all of us know. All right? So think of it like decision, where is the closest duster, right? So you look for that. By the way, I think, as I said, I can proceed with all this theory without assuming completeness, reflexivity, transitivity. I can give away all of them, provided I have some kind of regularity, I can work. But then things are going to look somewhat different, and I won't be able to talk about it. But the competitive equilibrium would still exist. I mean, it's fairly robust. That is time left, right? So think of this mythical economy that we are talking about, producing two goods with some resources that they have. So when we are looking at efficiency, I'm going to behave as if we have our, the leader, as I talked about, he has decided on what we can produce together. So let's draw that diagram. And this diagram that I'm going to draw is one of the, if you read one of the most famous textbooks of introductory economics is by Samuelson. When we grew up, it used to be only by Samuelson. Now Samuelson is dead and gone. So I don't know what is happening with that textbook. It's probably coming out with Samuelson and Nordhaus or something like that. Okay. There is a famous diagram, guns or butter. So diagram in that. So the economy is able to produce guns and butter. So how much to produce and what to produce? So I'm going to draw the guns and butter diagram, all right? So I'm going to make the same assumption that he did and assume that this is like so. So let's say that's X and this is Y. I leave out the guns and butter thing. It has to be a downward sloping diagram. The more you produce of one good, the less you should be able to produce of the other, because your resources get diverted, right? So it should be downward sloping. This shape, again, if you have particular kinds of, those who have done some economics, I can tell you if you have constant returns to scale or something in production, then you can draw it like this. Okay. If not, there may be some kinks and stuff. But again, so suppose our leader has decided that we shall produce so much, so much would be produced. Now, it's a question of distributing this, what we have produced, amongst the two individuals, all right? Let's say two individuals. How do we distribute? What would be efficient? Well, if you can draw the ISO U curves for both the individuals, then we may have some idea. So remember the U that we got? Well, we can draw all bundles which give you the same value of U. I call that an ISO U curve, or what in economics is called an indifference curve. All right? So for one of the individuals, say individual A, I draw ISO U curves like so. For the other, I take that as the origin, because remember that all I have to distribute is what has been produced, that is within this box. I can't go outside the box. So I draw I should have used the different colored chalk, but anyway, but you know the shapes A and B, okay? Now notice, what would be an efficient distribution? Can this be an efficient redistribution? That is, give to A so much and give the remaining to B. Notice that can't be, because here is another which is better for both, because it lies on a higher U curve for both individuals. Higher from this side, higher from that side. So that's not efficient. So you come to points like these, right? That must be true. That is, the common marginal rate of substitution, or the slope of the indifference curves, must be the same. So, slope what is that slope? That slope is the trade-off between producing one more unit of good X when you give up 1 unit of good Y. And just look at the diagram, you'll see that as you slide down that curve, you produce 1 more unit of X, you have to give up some units of Y. That releases certain factors. How many units of good X can you produce? That is approximately that slope. Now, it turns out that that depends on the ratio of marginal costs of the two goods. Think of marginal cost, right? What is marginal cost? The cost involved in producing one more unit of the good. So when you release 1 unit of Y, you release certain factors, right? That factor, if you evaluate, is roughly the marginal cost, right? I'm hand waving, but I can work all of this out. Now with this cost so far, how many units of good Y, X can you produce? Well, to produce 1 unit of good X, I need to spend the marginal cost of good X. So I divide marginal cost of X by the amount of marginal cost of Y to give me the amount of X that I can produce. So that is the argument. All right? That's why it's the ratio of marginal cost. So in some sense, what is happening is that this is the slope of marginal costs. Now condition B says that that slope must be equal to that slope. Now this, of course, is really quite not immediately seen. But here is why it must be so, if that is to be efficient. Suppose this ratio is 1 and that ratio is 2. So if that ratio is 1, what does it mean? It means for each individual, giving up 1 unit of X or Y would mean as if at the margin the same as 1 unit of X. So it's 1 to 1. So suppose you argue that this is an efficient distribution, then look at the following. I take away 1 unit of good Y from A. So A is of course worse off, right? I take away 1 unit of good Y from total production. How many units of good X can I produce? 2. With the 2 units of good X, I give back 1 unit, or I give both to A. E is compensated by 2 units of X, he is better off. B is no worse off, we have not touched him. So the other one could not have been efficient. Okay? So these two slopes must be the same. Now, how does competitive equilibrium get you in this? Notice the indifference curve slope is equal to the price ratio for an equilibrium. So they are across individuals, they all have the same price ratio, the same marginal rates of substitution, the same slopes because they are each equal to the price ratio. The price ratio is fixed, which is the equilibrium price ratio. So far as the marginal costs are concerned, the price ratio is equal to the ratio of marginal costs because the price ratio is equal to marginal cost. And ergo, therefore, these two slopes are equal. So the competitive equilibrium induces this. And it has to do with one single fact. The single fact is that the price ratio across individuals are the same. But this is a non-traditional way of proving the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics. Why? Because it seems to depend on so many derivatives, slopes, this, that, and the other. On the other hand, it's very revealing because it shows exactly what is at stake. And whenever the price ratios across individuals and firms differ, you have the so-called failure of the market to generate efficiency. And therefore, that is called a market failure. Which is why, see, one of the most common ways of deviating from the market is if you have a monopoly. That is a single firm deciding on what the prices are. For a single firm deciding on what the prices are, for that firm, price is not equal to marginal cost. You can work out what it is, right? For that firm, the marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. And price and marginal revenue, they have a relationship depending on elasticity of demand and all that. But because of that single difference, this thing breaks down. So, in fact, there are losses from a monopoly which no one gains from. And in fact, these are losses which, if you restrict the monopoly, you should be able to do away with, which is why in most countries of the world you have things which restrict monopoly behavior. See, when Microsoft ran into deep trouble when it started giving out that you must use Internet Explorer whenever you use Microsoft. And they lost that battle. The only reason was that it was a restrictive behavior on their part, which the courts ruled against them. All right? Now, it's time that I start talking about things that we were not aware of. See, something that I should tell you is that both this information that I talked about and incentives, both are areas in which Nobel Prizes have been awarded, right? I'm very bad with dates, so I don't remember which one got it first, but the incentive award, I think, went to Diamond and someone else, I can't remember. And the information thing went to Hurwitz. No, that was the incentive, yeah? Akerlof, Stiglitz, and that is information, and Spence. Now, one thing that I wanted to say, we got diverted about thinking of names. I'm very bad with names. I keep forgetting names now. So long as I remember mine, I think it's okay. Akerlof and Spence, both of them, they realized that information was a problem because they worked Akerlof worked in India and Stiglitz worked in Kenya. Akerlof's based the paper, the very famous Market for Lemons paper, which appeared in the QJE of 1970, I think, is perhaps the most influential paper in economic theory, the single most important paper. It was written while he was a visitor to the Indian Statistical Institute, and he was sitting on top of the Planning Commission those days in Yojana Bhavan in Delhi, and is the only paper in academic journals that I know of where references to Times of India and stuff are there. So he watched how markets operated in India, and he came to the conclusion that something needs to be done. And the same thing about, I didn't know about Stiglitz. In his speech, acceptance speech, which I read, he talks about his days in Kenya when he first. Now in Kenya too, you see, markets are not perfect. So there are problems, and these problems are there. The incentive problem, and here I'm hazarding a guess, is something that originated in the West, not in the underdeveloped countries. See, because here basically people did what they were told to, at least up till such time as the Second World War or something like that, when doing your work was important. If this was your work, you're supposed to do it well. But then, of course, people started asking, what is in it for me? What do I get out of it? And as soon as you start asking these questions, then the incentive problems become important, right? So we should see that both of them interplay and how they interplay. First, I think I'll be able to give you a flavor of Akerlof's paper. It's a beautiful paper. He talked about the market for lemons. Now, lemons is a word which is used in the West to describe automobiles which are, well, bad somehow. These may be new cars, but they are bad cars. My friends in the US say that when they go in to buy a car, they go to a dealership only if the dealership would give them a car which is manufactured on Wednesday or Thursday. Now, the question is why? Because Friday cars are put together in a hurry and therefore are likely to have defects. The Monday cars are equally, people are still getting out of the weekend syndrome, so there are problems. So if the dealer does you a good deal, he'll certify that the car is made on a Wednesday. I don't know whether this is true. I have not lived sufficiently long. Sometimes I have, but not very long. But my friends tell me that this is so. Now, this tells you why things are a bit of a problem. So he talked about cars which are, that can't be sort of set right. I mean, it's not a simple manufacturing defect. It's something which is serious. I mean, it's just junk. It may be a new car, but it's still bad. It may be an old car and still bad. But he talked about really the old car market. See, the problem about information is, you'll realize, is very simple. If I'm selling an old car, what will I say? Will I ever say that, look, I have an old car to sell, it's a piece of junk? I'll not say this. What will I say? The only thing I can say is that this is a damn good car, I'm sorry to let it go. So my saying this does not convey anything at all to the buyer. And no matter what I say, the buyer would not believe anything that I say. So there's complete lack of transmission of information between the buyer and the seller, right? So what happens to such markets? Well, let's think of, suppose in a place there are any number of old cars. So the demand-supply matching is not a problem, right? So there are any number of old cars available, any number of buyers possible, right? So the buyer thinks that he is willing to pay, let's say, 5,000 rupees. I mean, it's not a believable number. So what would be a believable number? Let's see, about 1 lakh for a car. Even that is not believable. 2 lakhs. All right, so the buyer says that 2 lakhs I'll want to. Whereas, so this is the buyer. And the seller is okay if he receives, say, 1.5 lakhs. He is willing to sell at 1.5. Now, if this be the situation, what do you think should happen? Any number of buyers and sellers. You should think that sometimes cars would sell for about somewhere in between 2 and 1.5, right? There should be no problem, market goes on. But now, hang on. The buyer thinks that half the car that are available in the market are junk, for which he is not prepared to pay even a single paise. All right? So half is junk. Now what happens? Now, any car which the buyer evaluates, you see, half it's worth 0 to him. Half it's worth 2 lakhs to him, or is willing to pay. So what is he willing to pay for the car? So he is willing to pay half into 0 plus half into 2. So he is prepared to pay at the most 1 lakh. But sellers are going to sell only for 1.5. So the market completely disappears. No one is buying, selling. The reason is that if it was information is not available symmetrically to both, otherwise what would have happened is the good cars would have sold for between 2 and 1.5 and the bad cars would not have sold at all, right? But now there are two phenomena which I would like to talk about, which I have noticed that people have talked about, that may happen. You see, what may happen is that only the bad cars get sold. Why? If you think for a little while, you'll realize that bad car owners would be willing to get rid of whatever they are getting, and so they'll say, okay. So basically, this is the process of what is known as adverse selection. All right? So the bad things keep coming up in the market, not the good things. The other is, if I may stretch this example for all it's worth, is that if you are an owner of a car, you don't take particularly good care of your car because you know there is not much resale value to having a good car, because you won't be able to tell people that it's a good car and no one would be willing to believe you. So you don't take good care of the car. That is precisely a case of moral hazard, that you don't take care of things that you take. The moral hazard is actually used more for insurance. If I take out, if you look at insurance policies, I remember when one was a graduate student in the US, one went out to get an insurance for the car, I mean, I was somewhat older than most others. So I was also married. They said, oh, good, then you have a lower rate. Do you have a child? I didn't have a child at that stage. If you have a child, we'll give it even lower. So the idea was that if you are a parent, right, and you have a child, then you'll drive a bit more carefully. Whereas if you are unmarried and young, then you just go all over the place, right? So you are not fit to be. So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. But moral hazard is the guy who takes out an insurance and then does damn all. I mean, so he doesn't take care. So that's moral hazard. So these are two kinds of things, but it's all because of this, what is called asymmetric information. It's the information available to buyers and sellers are not the same. Now notice I'm running short of time, so what I'll do is I'll tell you what can be done to retrieve this situation. What can be done to retrieve this situation is to introduce some kind of a rating agency. All right? So, and you've seen this happening in India. For example, now you have almost every car seller, Maruti or Hyundai or Honda or whatever, they sell cars which they certify to be good. They are used cars, but they certify that it is a good car. Of course, those prices are a lot more than what you may get from the market. And the reason being, you're paying for that certification. All right? So the market is in fact trying to correct this asymmetry. But then you have to pay for it, right? Often, what we need to do is, often what we need to do is to find out something special. If you're buying a car because you know a friend who is going off to the US or somewhere else and wants to sell off his car because he's not going to be using it, you try to buy that car. Even when you are buying a new car in India, because quality is not really all that sort of easily guaranteed. What do? You ask your friends, relatives, people around you who have bought cars, what their experience has been. Do they know a good dealer? Have they been given a good deal? And you go, I mean, the last time I bought a car, I benefited hugely because the president of Hyundai was a former student. So I rang him up and said, hey, I want to buy one of your cars. So he said, yes, sir, of course, sir. And then I bought a car. It came to my home, and when I took it for its first servicing, you should have seen, it's the president's car. It was noted on their computer as the president's car. And that was really a great car. I drove it for 15 years. But we cannot guarantee quality, you see. Because this quality brings to the question of asymmetric information. As soon as everyone would say that, who would tell you that when he's selling something that is inferior quality? So it brings immediately into discussion a wide range of things. How to regulate markets, what to do. And by the way, if you start regulating, then my other eye starts operating, incentives. That what incentive does the regulator have to regulate? So there is that. So this asymmetric information therefore just destroys markets, right? So if there are asymmetric information, and in one kind or the other, if you bring in quality immediately, that brings in asymmetric information. So the market may disappear itself, or it may just give you bad cars. And of course, these are trades which you would not have made if you had known. And sometimes you do regret having traded. Free trade, we are told in economics, is always better than no trade. Yes, if the quality is ascertained. But if there is asymmetric information, then you have problems. All right. In matters, for instance, which Professor Bhaduri has talked about, globalization and what it leads to. In fact, if you look at what happens because of globalization, a lot of goods start flowing into your country, which in fact would not be sold elsewhere. They are of an inferior quality. Now, if that was all, then fine. But if you had things like Bhopal happening, then that is because there are less controls here. And then things are set up here which should not be allowed anywhere. So these are problems that keep happening, okay? I will next, and I'm getting sort of tired at this stage, next thing that I'll talk about is how the market can be manipulated because of the incentive to do so. So information, and I'll talk about the classic case of externalities, which we know for many, many years causes a problem to the first fundamental theorem. So these two would, let me see how long that would take. All right. Can I break off here? I still have 11 minutes.
Can I ask you one question?
Yeah, sure.
So in the car market that you talked about, so in that case, so the certification of a used car by an agent, if we apply this model, then it means that the cost of certifying, marginal cost of certifying, should be exactly equal to the price of certifying. So that price should be added to the price that he sets to the old car. So if we see that process from this through this model, so it should happen that way, right? But what you actually see is that the traders, let's say Maruti or Hyundai,
They add a lot more.
So in a sense that you inevitably have non-perfect competition creeping in this markets.
My reaction to that would be that, look, you see, the reason why they are able to jack it up is because there are people who are willing to pay for it. You see, if people did not pay for it, if they can't sell, they would sell, right? They'd sell at a lower price. But if they can sell at a higher price, why not? So they'll jack it up to the extent possible. There's a good deal of trade-off there, because you can, in fact, sort of when you trade in, for instance, they don't give you anything at all, right? So basically, the problem to me is that you are not prepared to haggle, and these guys will wait for, right? So I think there is imperfection, of course. But the idea being that is, if you're not too far away from, it's better than not having it at all, right? If you have certification, sometimes you might say, okay, I may end up paying a little bit more, but I'm sure I have a guarantee which says, so how much are you willing to pay for it? It will vary across individuals, you see. So the marginal benefit of a certified car for an owner is also different. So they work on that margin, you see.
So in that case, one related question is that, so when you and I, when we go to buy a car, okay, the marginal benefit calculation that we make in our minds, is that not just about, okay, Hyundai is a great company, but it's also the expected utility that we expect to derive from a product, from the car. So if it becomes a matter of belief, we don't know, right? First of all, we don't know.
It's the quality angle. We don't know the quality, and we cannot guarantee what the quality would be. See, and here some examples maybe. What is good quality public service? For example, 8 minutes is enough for me to tell you a story. See, the way I look at it is, there are mathematicians in this audience. They also use examples, right? But those examples are often to nullify certain claims. Oh, you claim this, here is an example which violates. But certainly sometimes examples are useful because they show a particular fact. So this is not to nullify something, but to show what can happen and why you have the trust or you believe that this is going to happen. Now, there was a year I spent teaching in Japan. Now, why, where to, let's not ask that question. But I used to stay far away from the city center, and I had to come from the university to the city center by the university bus, and then I'd take a city bus to go to where I stayed. Right? So there was one bus at about 5:30. And the next bus was at 7:30. So I wanted to catch that 5:30 because 7:30 bus was too far away. So one day I was there exactly at 5:25, and the bus came, stopped, the door opened. Now in Japan, the next 3 stops are shown, and mine was the 3rd stop. And it is, of course, only in Japanese, katakana and so on. So I had learned enough to be able to read or recognize my stop. So I looked at it, it wasn't there, so I realized this must be a different bus, so I stood back. There's a gentleman who used to also get onto the same bus, a Japanese. He also looked at it. He used to take the same bus with me every day. He also stood back, the bus closed door and went away. Then he turned to me, and for the first time, he spoke to me in English saying that, do you read Japanese? I said, well, not quite, but our stop was not there. So he said, yeah, you're right. But where's our bus? So we waited for 5 minutes, fidgeting. Then he said, I'm going to call. And those days, there was still no mobile phones or something, right? So he went to the city center, had the office of the bus company also was there. They were closing shop, so he went there and spoke. And then he came back looking very satisfied. So he said, well, that was the bus. What had happened was that the bus driver had forgotten to fix the thing. You know, that happens everywhere, that it was starting from the city center, so it should have fixed things so that it started again from initial conditions. So I said, oh no, that means 2 hours. So he said, no, they're making arrangements. So I said, arrangements? By that time, 2 taxis turned up to take us to our point. So then we looked at one another. 2 taxis are too much for 2 persons going to the same place. So we shared a taxi. We got off at the place that we got off. We tried to pay. He said, no, that's paid for the bus company. So now after that incident, you would have some trust for the way the bus systems operate. So they put up a schedule, and what does that mean? It means that we guarantee that this will happen. So guaranteeing quality comes from there. So if there is some problem with it, we'll fix it to the best that we can. And so once they do it, but here, does it happen like that? The problem is here it doesn't happen. I mean, the minute you buy something in the market, the guy, till the moment that you sign off or you buy, he is eagerly explaining. The minute everything is done, he said, well, if it goes bad, you have to write to the company. Now the company, God knows where it is, how it will read. So you see, that is where the trust, in fact, goes bad. So that's the problem about quality, you see. That is why inefficiency. So trades that could have happened do not take place. Right?
So the price system cannot guarantee that.
No. It cannot. It cannot because it will be, as I will also show, there are other facts of it. It's not only asymmetric information or quality, there are other aspects. Because suppose for some reason you even fix this thing. Externalities and manipulation would be the other thing, which I'll talk about next.
I think we'll stop here.
Yeah, I'm getting.
Time it properly.
So I was talking about how things may deteriorate in markets. And I'm going to talk about the classic case first. You know, the case which the earlier classical writers were always aware of. But somehow they thought that that was only a special case and not something which would be of very great importance, shall we say. But this is a case of externalities. Now, best way to understand externalities is to take an extreme example of an externality, the case of public goods. Now, what are public goods? Well, there are two things about public goods which are special. The first is that these goods are available for joint consumption, right? And secondly, that you can't exclude people from it. So what do I mean? When I buy a shirt, so long as I don't lend it to someone, it's my shirt and you don't have access to it, right? Automatically. But if I have a public park, then I can use it, you can use it. I mean, there is a problem about congestion, but we'll talk about that later on. But apart from that, it's available for everyone. Or the most classic example of a public good is national defense. See, when the government builds national defense, it's available for everyone, right? So my use of the whatever facilities are available does not preclude your use of the same facilities, right? And yet there is a problem with all these public goods, because if I'm asked how much am I willing to pay for the public good, I might say 0. Why? It's not because I don't want that public good, but I know that if it is available, no one can exclude me from it. In a much sort of trivializing the entire thing, if you go to a block of apartments, private apartments, on the stairs, you'll invariably notice that the lights don't work. And part of that is this publicness of it, because the others think, some or most people think, that, well, I mean, it's the guy on the top, he'll fix it because it's the most for him or her. So I may not. And so no one gets to. Yeah, the most classic story of the public good is one reads in the, or externality of this type, or free riding as it is called, is the following story. When a king asked all his subjects to fill up a pond with milk, and he said, well, it's now been dug, and all of you would now put in a bucket of milk. And next morning, the king, to his astonishment, found that it was all clear water. Everyone put in a bucket of water, thinking it would be the other guy who would put in the milk, right? So no one did that. And so you have the classic exhibition of the undersupply of public goods. Undersupply compared to what? What is desirable? If you went by the market. That is, if you wanted to price these things, if you wanted to price national defense, no one would pay for national defense, right? The reason is no one would say that we'll have it, and so if no one pays for it, it won't be available, and then we will be in a mess. Right? In fact, those of you who have studied game theory would realize that what is at stake is something like a prisoner's dilemma, where if you let people do whatever they wish, then that may not be the best possible outcome. So some cooperation is required. So let's look at an example. Just as we looked for the perfectly competitive case, what the efficiency conditions were, let's try to think of a situation where you have a public good and another good. Now, to distinguish it from the other good, we have to, public good, we have to call it a private good. It's not a good name. Private goods are goods which are excludable and no joint consumption. So it's like a shirt. When I buy it, I have to pay a price, or otherwise someone has to gift it to me. But it's mine alone. So again, think of the two good situation. Think of good X is the public good, good Y is the private good. So good X, whatever is available, is jointly available to both people, right? What I'm going to tell you about is a result which goes back to Paul Samuelson's classic paper called The Pure Theory of Public Expenditure. And what I'm going to give you is a slight variation of his treatment, right? So there are two goods. So I draw the production possibility locus. So what am I doing? I'm trying to locate conditions for an efficient state here. All right? Now, remember the definition of an efficient state. Definition remains the same. It's a state such that there is no other feasible state such that you can make someone better and no one worse, okay? So suppose there are two individuals, right? So A and B, and let's say the one way of tracking the efficient point is to, let's say, that is A's level of indifference, that you want to keep A, and then you want to say, what should you do to make B as well off as possible, subject to the constraints? Because then you know that if you have solved it correctly, then you can't make, if you make A better off, then B can't be as well off as before, and you can't make B better off subject to A being. So it will be efficient. Okay? So that's a natural way of defining an efficient state. Okay? So now notice that if you produce here, then what would you have to give to B? I'm looking at it from the point of view of the manager. He's not here, but assume he's there here for the moment. Right? So notice that you have to keep A at this level. So you have to give this entire amount of Y to A. And the only thing that B has is X because it can be jointly consumed. Right? You can't give any Y to B. Is that clear? Why you can't give any Y to B if you produce there, right? Because as soon as you give some Y to B, you fall below that curve. But you have to keep A on that curve. Similarly, if you produce here, similarly, the entire Y has to go to A, and you can't give anything to B, okay? So I've just marked off in a separate diagram what I have to give to B. Here I have to give to B, I can give to B X bar, and there I can give to B X hat. And in between, of course, there is some curve like this, let's say. It goes up, comes down, and so on. This is amounts of Y that I can give to B if I produce somewhere in this region. So what would be efficient? So I look at B's ISO-U curves. Notice that is the highest ISO-U curve of B that I can reach, right? So this much is Y star, and this much I give to A. That is my efficient, that's my efficient X star, and that entire thing I produce. I give Y star to B, and that remaining bit to A, and that's an efficient state. Right? So I've tracked down one efficient state, or the efficient state in this case. Well, what happens there? Notice that the slope of this curve is tangential to the slope of this curve. What is this curve? This has been actually obtained as the difference between these two curves, vertical displacement, right? Because of the public nature of X and the private nature of Y. So therefore, here the slope of B's indifference curve is equal to the slope of the production possibility locus minus the slope of A's indifference curve. So you should be able to immediately sense that things have gone completely haywire, because earlier what was happening was slope of A's indifference curve is equal to the slope of B's indifference curve is equal to the slope of the production possibility locus. Here, slope of our A's indifference curve plus the slope of B's indifference curve is equal to the slope, right? So now notice what would happen if you were to follow the market. If you were to follow the market, A's indifference curve would be the slope of the price ratio. B's indifference curve would be the price ratio. So P plus P, so 2P. And the production possibility locus would be the price ratio. So 2P can never be equal to P. So that will not happen. So that condition goes. So you will not be able to replicate this. And so what do you do? Again, just as with the asymmetric information case, we said that sending in a regulator might help mitigate the problem.
Can you explain what you meant by you cannot replicate it?
You cannot replicate the result that equilibrium is efficient. All right? Because in the equilibrium, you'd have all the equalities. But efficiency does not demand that. Efficiency demands something else. All right? Now, if you think for a little while, you may realize what is happening is that when you produce a public good, that immediately gives a certain, just the fact that it is available for consumption. The guys don't have to pay for it to consume and to derive any benefit from it, right? So it's essentially that aspect which is working against your getting the efficiency result, the equilibrium equal to efficiency result. So what is usually predicted in this case is that there should be something called the government. The government steps in, decides on what the level of the public good is, and then extracts taxation. Whether you like it or not, this is what you have to pay. Right? Because after all, where does the government gets fund from? Now, there's a huge debate in economics on the role of the government. And maybe I should spend a few minutes talking about that. And I can only do that by going back to another very classic paper by another person who wrote about these kinds of things many, many years ago. A man called Richard Coase. Coase, C-O-A-S-E. I think his paper was in the 50s, I think. And in a very obscure journal which no one read till he got the Nobel Prize. He was a great influence at the University of Chicago. The reason is that he advocated that, look, here for the government to actually dictate on what the tax rates ought to be to restore efficiency. I mean, I have in my book, I have worked out details. I've also worked out the more general case of what happens when you get corner, maxima, minima, how the result changes. All that I have worked out with my general equilibrium book. So there, you see, enormous amount of information is required to get the tax rates correct. You don't know everything about individuals, and of course the thing is that it's not possible for the government to process such information. So what should they do? Well, they do the best they can. They take some surveys, and on that basis they produce some kind of an approximation. So the argument, of course, was that, look, we are going about it the wrong way. And he gave an example of an externality. And that is one of the most classic examples, but as I tell you the example, you'll realize what time he is writing about. He stayed in Chicago. And Chicago, you know, is in the Midwest, right, of the US. And it borders on the largest wheat fields that you can think of, right? And as everywhere else, there are rail lines which run through the wheat fields. And you'll always notice that the rail lines are on an embankment. So the wheat, when it was gathered, was brought and kept close to the embankment, and the trains would go up and down. But the trains were steam locomotives. So I don't think any of you have seen a steam locomotive. But steam locomotives used to run on coal, and there would be sparks flying. And these sparks would often fall on the wheat fields and ignite them and destroy them, right? So there was a classic externality problem. It's an externality how? Because the farmers are being affected by a decision of their train company, which they cannot control, right? And the train company, in its own way, say, who asked you to keep it so close? And that's because that's the only place they can keep it, because the rest is the feed. They want to take it to the extreme and stop. So how do you solve this? Taxes, government setting taxes. Cose's solution was that, look, assign property rights appropriately. You say that the train company has the right to run its train up and down as it wishes. Then the farmers can gather together and approach the train company and tell them that, look, you cut down your train running by about half, and we will pay you for the losses that you would have otherwise made. And there's some negotiation takes place. There's a transfer from the train company, from the farmers to the train company, and efficiency is restored. It can be shown. If there are no substantial transaction costs, that is, if negotiation is costless and free. Alternatively, you give the property rights to the farmers. Then the train company can say that, look, we will pay you for whatever losses, but let us run the trains. Right? And some negotiation, and again the same thing. So it's a question of assigning property rights. The government doesn't come in. That was Cose's argument, right? My problem with this is that, okay, you have this arrangement, but someone has to step in to guarantee that this contractual obligation works. Because suppose the government assigns the property rights to the train company, and the farmers go and plead with the train company, and the train company says, go, you take a flying jump. We couldn't care less. So the entire thing breaks down. So someone has to protect the farmer's rights. Who protects it? Or whoever protects the property rights. I mean, do I have property rights just because the government says so? Well, yes and no. What happens if my property rights are questioned? Someone comes and thrashes me up. Do I have any recourse to law? So you know immediately there are other considerations which keep coming up. And if those things are not particularly good, then of course this thing will not work. And the government or the judiciary or what have you is important to come in to ensure that property rights are maintained. All right? So basically, I think the problem therefore is that if the state mechanism is weak, then externality problems are going to appear. And externality problems are going to be very important because they're widespread. Think of education. How much education to be provide? Does education provide any externality? And the answer is yes, it does. Maybe debatable how much, but certainly why are there so many schools and colleges? I mean, that's the only way that you can assure your society or your children to wake up and go for higher studies, jobs, training, what have you. And you can build world beaters, so to speak. You see, after all, if you can develop a technology which is to the benefit of the country, then clearly that is something that you ought to strive for. And clearly, if you just train one person, the question of a world beater does not. But if you train 1 million, then the couple of world beaters coming out becomes all the more realistic. So there's a sufficient amount of externality. What about health? Health services also produce a large amount of externalities. And there are some diseases which are, of course, you can carry across. So you'd rather not be close to someone who has a cold or some other disease which can carry. So basically, therefore, there is a lot to be said. In fact, try to hunt up something. You can have an argument about whether it's the school education or the higher education or what have you. Yeah, I mean, to some degrees, but let me see, we haven't understood this, but I don't have it immediately. It will take me too much time to just remind me sometime tomorrow. I'll talk about it. There is a piece by a professor of psychology at Swarthmore, very famous, who was giving the commencement address, and he found that that was very well received, so he wrote a book called The Costs of Living, in which he says that what can we depend on the market to allocate appropriately. And he says that if it is things like designer jeans and compact discs and things of that kind, maybe we can ask the markets to allocate properly. But if it is anything that you value, then you cannot really, and then the things that you can value are things like education, health, jobs, name it, environment, appropriate. You cannot leave it to the markets. So, in fact, I think basically the environmental, the externality factor, public goods is an extreme example, but some kind of externality coming in, pollution is also an externality. It's of a bad kind. See, the thing that you can show is that if it is a beneficial externality, then and you compare efficient states with the competitive market state, you will find that beneficial externalities in a market state would be too little compared to what efficiency demands. So too little resources would go to so just like education, if you leave education to the market, there will be too little resources going to education. Whereas it's a negative externality like a pollution, and you compare again the efficient with the market, then you'll find that too much of pollution would be created. Too much stuff would be going in, resources would be tied up in polluting industries. So it's kind of, how shall I say, the market really misbehaves in this case. But that's the way the market is supposed to behave. We know that this is what it will do. And we need to correct it. And as I said, correcting creates problems. Now, someone picked up my copy of the paper, huh? Yeah, thanks. In fact, in this paper, there is what I want to talk about. So I have roughly not talked about the details, but I want to talk about the manipulation part now. Now, what do I mean by manipulation? What I mean is the following. Yeah. Could you speak up, please?
Yeah. So, sir, regarding externalities, So, since Cose's sole point was assigning property rights and keeping the government intervention to the minimal, right? So, did he not come up with a solution as to what happens to the like a proper solution? So, who guards the rights of the party who doesn't get the property rights, and who gets the property rights in the first place? Since it's really unfair on the part of the person or the group who doesn't have the property rights to begin with.
Yeah, well, you see, there are two aspects to your question. One is who gets the property rights, right? Who decides, right? So far as efficiency consideration matters, this question is not important. But suppose you decide anyhow to give the property rights to one. What happens is, because of that, the distribution amongst classes changes, right? But it will not destroy efficiency. You may have a moral argument there that whether farmers should have the property rights or the train company. That's different. And we can talk about it at length. We won't come to any solution. My point is that suppose you give it to anyone, even then it will not work, because you have to have the government actually protecting that property right. If you don't protect, then you can't ensure property rights. So my point was that property rights need protection. And the government role has been changed. Instead of calculating what various rates are to what the taxes should be, now it has to go out and protect property rights. And that was the point I was making. All right? Now, this manipulation angle is not a very strange thing I'm talking about. You would have read in the papers, for example, about Volkswagen. What did Volkswagen do? Volkswagen, of course, is one of the most famous manufacturers of automobiles. What did it do? It just did something with the software so that whenever you try to measure the pollution control emission of that car, you would get a wrong reading. You'd get an underestimate of what the reading is. So look at the cheating involved by Volkswagen. Now I'm told that there are problems with Honda because the airbags may explode. There may be. Now, this is like, as I was telling someone while we were having, I think I was talking to you, about when you go to buy vegetables, right? What happens? You know, the guy measures, let's say you're buying potatoes, is measuring potatoes. You remember that it's a contractual obligation that you have undertaken. Decided to buy 1 kilo of vegetables from this guy at a certain price. So that's a contract. That person would sell you exactly 1 kilo of good quality potatoes. You are not buying rotten potatoes, right? And you are under obligation to pay the price that you have contracted. So suppose instead of 1 kilo, he sells you 900 grams. Would you get to know? You would not know, right? Unless, I remember now, my grandfather used to walk along with when he used to go to the market. He would sometimes, when he suspected, he would whip out his own scales, which he kept in his pocket, and he'd weigh it. So not too many of the shopkeepers would like to trade with my grandfather. They would say, oh, no, not. So that was the reason. Same, there are lots of people I know who fold a torn rupee note and give it to that fellow, in the hope that in the milieu the chap will not notice. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to give him good legal money. All right? So contractual obligations are manipulated. What is the guy doing when he sells you 900 grams? He's actually jacking up the price. So he's controlling the price. That's what he is doing. Is it beneficial for him? Of course it is. It's beneficial for him that you behave passively, you accept whatever is given to you as our textbook. Right? So, in fact, in the paper, I have a fairly general demonstration of how there will be at least one person in the competitive framework who would find it profitable to deviate from whatever transaction he or she is supposed to have made. And so, therefore, he would. So therefore, what remains? You are not even making the competition. You are not even close to the. So suppose you get rid of you get rid of all these exceptions. You get rid of all these exceptions. Still, this manipulability, or I'm not calling it cheating, but it's basically incentive. What incentive does the trader have to carry out whatever is supposed to do? No incentives whatsoever if he or she can deviate and do something which is gives him or her a higher level of profits. Now, how do you correct that? Well, you see, there is only one thing that you Oh, yeah. This thing, I was looking for it in the wrong place. It's out here in the handout. This is the chap from the Swarthmore College. Schwartz. Where is Schwartz? The costs of living, it's 1994. He says, the things we are, what type of goods can we expect the markets to allocate correctly? The things we are talking about are trivial: designer jeans, compact discs, deodorant soaps, different types of breakfast cereal. On the contrary, he goes on to argue, when things we are talking about are judged by society to be too important, things like food, housing, education, healthcare, transportation, jobs, the market would be unacceptable. All right? As I have argued throughout from the morning, that he was wrong even about compact discs and designer jeans. You might end up buying fake designer jeans or compact discs which do not work. You know, I mean, if you have been to Delhi, there is a market where you buy almost all kinds of software which are sort of pirated. To test out someone, there is a rather well-known software called Mathematica. So I asked around. I said, "Hey, Mathematica milta hai?" I said, "Haan, zarur." So he said, "How much?" I said, 200 rupees. Now, you see, the Mathematica costs, last time I inquired, $2,000. All right? So I said, 200 rupees is worth taking a risk. So he said, "You wait here." So I realized it was piracy and so on and so forth, and I should not play. But I just wanted to see what would happen. So I gave the guy 200 rupees and he ran away somewhere. And then after about 15 minutes, he came back with a CD. He said, "Leke jaiye, yahan mat khada rahiye. You take it and run." I came back home and found it was a nice CD. It had nothing on it. So the point was that I had been gypped. I mean, I was a fool actually, even to have thought, but I thought he would give me something at least, but there's nothing. So the market operates in various ways. You know, it offers you a transaction where, see, I'm always a sucker. I always believe that the guy is going to give me a reasonable deal. But a large number of times, yes. But often, it doesn't. So, what do you need to do to essentially guard against manipulation? I mean, it's impossible for there to be a checking fellow behind every trader, right? That's not possible. But there was a time when things were not so, when you gave a word about something that meant something. In still some places this works, but in most places it doesn't. So we have lost that, and I think we need to get back to it. In fact, see, very often people talk about the fact that, you know, markets must operate under, you know, animal spirits and so on. It's the animal spirits which are getting you down. See, if you look at what I quote again from Sen, this is the preponderance of self-interest, sometimes attributed to Adam Smith, is supposed to be the backbone of market mechanism. But Sen writes, I find it amazing that so many advocates of the glory of capitalism refuse to see the moral quality of good business behavior. And it's only now that people have woken up that in all the business schools, you have courses on ethics, right? Now, as I'm going to argue as we go to tomorrow, things would suddenly become all the more very difficult once we introduce questions of money and the future. But essentially the same problems would remain, would reappear much more viciously. You know, the problem of asymmetric information and incentives. And that is what would perhaps be important in understanding your notion of why markets fail. So I've been talking for some time. Let me take a short break and ask questions. Yes, please speak into a microphone. Turn it on, yes.
Like consumer forums, wouldn't ethics actually be an incentive for companies in terms of getting a loyal customer base?
Yeah, very good question. I think, you see, one of the ways that we can in fact bring in people to behave ethically is to have consumer forums, have civic bodies step in. Indeed, start from school. In school, you teach people about, I don't know, when we were kids, we always had a class on moral behavior or something. I think we ought to have paid more attention to it than we have. These days, of course, people don't pay attention to it. But these are important considerations. Yeah, just...
if we take the example of Hawala, I mean, Hawala market doesn't have anything on paper. It's an underground system, but yet it's one of the most organized system. It's purely on the word. So there is no market failure in this unless an excessive information is leaked out in the market. which breaks the channel of the market. Then how does that work?
You see, the Hawala market is illegal, right? It's illegal and therefore it violates it is word of mouth, but it's also fear. If you would not to follow through or do whatever you're supposed to do, then someone is going to come and beat you up. All right? So there is coercion. There is certain amount of coercion, and that would work. See, which is why, you see, these days everyone talks about India and China, they keep talking about. One of the good things about China is that you know exactly what you are getting into, because you know what the rule of the law is. The same as in Japan. I was told didn't I find Japan very bureaucratic? Of course it's bureaucratic, but you knew what the laws were. You knew what the rules of the game. So once you know the rules of the game and you keep within it, there's no problem. You try to go beyond it, of course there are problems, huge problems. There is another question, whether you like the rules of the game or not. You may not like the rules of the game. They may not be fair. Right. So all those are different considerations. But at least things happen. All kinds of odd things may happen also. I mean, that's different. But in India, we have a problem, which is that the markets don't operate, our legal systems are weak. We are, for example, fighting a case on our pension, and that the judge doesn't have time to listen to us, so he keeps giving us a different date. Now, pension cases, I thought, all of us are getting on. Some of us are gone, actually. But shouldn't it have been heard much more quickly and given a result that, okay, you don't deserve it, or you deserve it, or whatever. But things don't work like that. And so therefore, there are all the more reasons why markets will fail, right? And this question of trust, which is important, which Hani just now mentioned. In the Hawala, there's a sort of trust that if I give him the money, that will go there. Why do I know that it will go there? Because if I go and make a complaint that it hasn't gone, then that guy would be thrashed up, right? We don't have the same thing when we send something by courier, right? Even the best of couriers goof up. But that's not retaining efficiency, it's making something work, but something on which someone is making profits, which were not dictated by how the competitive market, and that price of that is in any case is being set by a monopolist. If you have time, I can show you exactly in a single diagram, which of course is an undergraduate. I think undergraduate economics is pretty good. It tells you what is happening. May not be about all the solutions that you come up with, but you have to constantly go back and forth between the undergraduate and looking at more general solutions or more general situations. See, the undergraduate monopolist, for example, why does it lead to an inefficiency? Think of a monopolist selling a product in a market. So, we are thinking about a product which is being demanded by a lot of small consumers. So there is some demand for the product, some demand curve. So there is a price, and there is a quantity, and let's say that's the demand curve. So what does that mean? It means that if the monopolist sets this price, he has so much he can sell. He can't sell more because there is no demand. So now the monopolist has to think of what price to sell. Right? So what does the monopolist do? So the monopolist says, okay, this is my cost of producing Q units, and this is still the same, but hang on, this P I know is a function of Q, which is the demand curve. So I have to maximize this by choosing Q. So now notice what happens. You take derivatives, and correct me if I fall flat on my face. Oh, this, of course, is your P. Now, previously, it was P equals marginal cost. Now, it's P plus all this. Right? So, there's something else. Now, F prime Q, you know, is negative. All right? Why? Because demand curve is downward sloping. So, it's some curve which lies here, and you draw the marginal cost curve somewhere here, and you equate this, and that is your profit maximization, right? Whereas under competition, it would have been that. And you notice that this is that shaded triangle is what is lost to both buyers and sellers, that no one gets that region. And that is the inefficiency of a monopolist. That's why you don't want to have monopolists, let me say. So, you see, that is the price control. And in fact, you see, the manipulation is always an active effort on the part of some participant to claim monopoly powers, right? And once the monopoly powers are there, then you can extract more surplus. Obviously, the monopolist makes more profit than a perfectly competitive firm. But then he messes it up by taking away some things from the consumer side, and he can't extract the entire thing. Under certain extreme cases, he can even extract that triangle, but that is only an extreme case. That never happens. Yeah. Please use that's in front of you.
Markets in operation, what we generally see in real life are basically oligopolies that usually exist in almost every sector.
The same thing happens.
Yeah, I mean,
the triangle would just be smaller.
Smaller. Yeah. The second question is, the factors.
Yeah, you see, what happens is that marginal revenue would depend on what the others do, right? Yeah. And in the Nash equilibrium that follows, you'll get a similar kind of looking condition. Just write down, let's say, Cournot or something. More the better. But in some sense, the more players there are, the smaller would be the triangle. So there'll be some loss, some gain to the consumers. Yeah.
Another part is, do we really need markets at all? Because since you spoke about for what sectors do we need market and do we not? Because markets are also a very primitive mechanism. In today's technology, given the things that we have, there might be much better mechanisms that we can devise for like resource distribution. For instance, just recently
No,
in
the
Chennai-
market, everything is a market. I mean, the markets look different, right? When I buy from Amazon, I'm also buying from a market.
I'm not talking about that. Let's take like a public distribution system. I wouldn't call it a market, right? I mean, so similarly, you can have a fairly well organized, because Oscar Lange, I'm talking about, he spoke about the rule of computers in socialist organization of distribution. I mean, like, so given,
The computers, you think, make it fairer.
I mean, you can perhaps have nicer linear programming models which can perhaps distribute much
But I thought that is the source of the greatest amount of fraud. Yeah, because someone may hack. I mean, I'm for instance, completely ignorant. Or you may be much better qualified to handle a computer than I am, right? So it depends. I'm not convinced that computers allow you to. But if there was a way in which manipulation can be cut down, like measurement could be reduced, quality could be ascertained, yes, surely. All these things would be reduced, yeah, surely. But I'm just saying that I don't see anything. You see, because now, for example, there are even more variety of things that are being sold. For instance, you will get to know about them, about the derivatives markets, for example. When you buy some of these derivatives, you don't exactly know what you're buying. You're just being promised some returns in the future. Sometimes the guy selling it to you also doesn't know what he or she is selling to you. You probe them, and then you find that one. No, it's a guy who keeps on telling me that I should buy mutual funds. I say, at my age, right, I should not buy mutual funds. You put my money in a fixed deposit. And he says, no, you are losing out on inflation. He is telling me, I mean, he's trying to teach me about how to. So I say, look, I mean, yeah, I listen. But then, you see, he goes on, he says, have a long horizon. I said, I don't have a long horizon. He said, 5 years. I said, okay, 5 years down the road, I suppose I'll still be around. But can you guarantee me that the market will be up 5 years down the road? And then he's quiet, because see, the problem about all these instruments is what time do you withdraw? When you withdraw, when you need, is the market up or down? I mean, you can't quite guarantee one way or the other. What they say is the law of large numbers. If you start from 0 and go to infinity, then the average would smoothen out and you'd be making money. But the average is a very deceptive thing. You see, just 1 minute. There's a story about a guy who wanted to cross a river, which was told he didn't know how to swim. He was told that the average depth of the river was only 4 feet. So he tried to walk across. Forgotten, he was more than 4 feet tall. But certainly there were regions of the river, I didn't see you. I suddenly saw you. The average was a lot more. So you see, the average therefore is, so it's uncertain. So, can you speak a bit slowly and switch?
So my point is, do we really need markets at all as a resource distribution system today? I mean, because markets can be done away with is my contention. I mean, because the growth of technology can enable, like what one Mrs. has to say about the socialist information problem can be done away with technology.
You are calling markets by some other name and saying markets have been done away with. Some such agency is there through which buying and selling is happening. Unless you say that there is no buying and selling. then there is some person who decides to redistribute. There is a theory which I have not talked about, which is the application of cooperative games to solution problems. There are no markets. So what happens there is that we decide on what would happen to each, or what goods would be given to each and every one of us. And if we don't like, we can say, sorry, I don't want it. Or if she and I, we decide that no, we don't want this because by ourselves we can do better, we can do it. So that's called blocking. So there is a theorem which says that the only allocation which cannot be blocked is the competitive allocation. So the competitive market, see, you can do away with markets, but the competitive solution would remain. And it would have properties which would be desirable, right? So surely you can do away with, whatever you do, you cannot better the competitive situation. There will be something or the other.
Call the institution by which you reach the solution. He's saying that that is what he's trying to get at, I think. That the institution as we know today is some idealized picture of the market. But you can get it, for example, through if you have sufficient information or homogeneity among the people to discuss and then decide. Of course, you don't need a market. But that is an institution, and there are people have all along in politics dreamed of such cases, that when you can do it and so on. I think that is...
Yeah, look, the market is an institution, doesn't work, but it's the best that works, and therefore you try to adjust it some way or the other. The question is what? And to know what it can do to you. It can harm you. So anytime people say that you should not look at your own interest, they're making a mistake. You had a question up there. Yes.
So, for instance, there's the AT&T Bell Labs monopoly. There was just one supplier of telephones, but their monopolistic structure also allowed them to fund very, very risky innovations.
Yeah, wait a minute. I think I know what you are getting after. If that is so, then let's not carry this further.
Okay.
Because if you're talking about inventions, R&D, research, you've forgotten what I said at the beginning in the morning. There is no time in my discussion today. All right? Now, there have been studies made by many people, mainly out of Chicago, who have argued that exactly what you are talking about, that is returns to better technology, returns to technology, and so on, to society and so on, that these little triangles get more than waved out. But if that be so, why are there so many monopolies and restricted trade practices bodies all over the world? So that's not, well, it certainly does take it away, but we still don't buy that completely. Okay? So we'll talk about time, and you'll find that there are a lot more difficult situations that we can talk about. But that's just talking about what happens static, one period.
So this just goes back to what you talked about initially when you were talking about informational asymmetries. So I was just wondering that you spoke about credit ratings and credit agencies, but so if any consumer can say go online and figure out what ratings are attached to which products, or if he or she can just walk into a showroom and see that everything there has a certain seal of quality or certification or whatever. So if that information is thanks to these agencies freely available, then does information take on the nature of a public good? And if it does, then why would individuals be willing to pay extra for it?
Well, I mean, if there are, I know of no rating agencies ratings which are freely available. There may be some. But every time you want some of these ratings, you have to sign up for some deal or the other. They will then agree to tell you exactly what they think of various products. So there is that. So it's not, therefore it's not, it is excludable. All right? So it's not in the nature of a public good. But if you make this available freely, then of course no one would be willing to pay for it. Well, that's the very reason why it won't be made freely available, because it takes costs to have this rating. So why should they do something, give away a service for free? They won't. So, both ways it is not going to work. They're not going to make it available freely. And in fact, you'll have to pay for it. Once you start paying for it, well, if it is any good, but even there, how the hell do you know that these guys are doing a correct job? That they are rating it correctly. You're assuming that they're doing a correct job.
So then you have to incentivize the rating agencies or make...
Yeah, but then you go back to this manipulability thing, look. There are two things that come to mind. One is that nowadays we have this different revenue model
where the advertisements that they put up on their websites, so you're doing it online, so that depends on the number of hits. And so if your rating doesn't work or whatever it is, then in the future, so the time comes in. The other problem which happened in the recent financial crisis was one of these problems with these rating agencies. Now the person who are going to sell the derivatives, now they go to these rating agencies to get their thing rated. And so there was this big problem, which also, some of these rating agencies got sued for that. I don't know what the status of that is. So there is this competition. So this guy says, look, if you don't give me a good rating, I'm going to go to your competitor. So there was that problem.
Yeah. No, I think basically I was not going to talk about the financial crisis because I thought I would talk about it tomorrow. It's very difficult to talk about it because it's sort of amorphous, but it is going to show all the things that I talked about today. They are going to reappear much more viciously when you have time, right? And there are several more interesting ways of doing things so that you make a lot of money. In fact, when the first I think not the first, when the Lehman Brothers crashed, right? Then they were bailed out by the government. They're too big to fail, so they were bailed out. And strangely, there was one person who was very angry and he kept on shouting, There's an economist, he was not a macro theorist or anything, he was a game theorist. Robert Aumann. He gave a statement saying that, look, why don't they realize the day, in fact, the bailout was announced? He said that these guys, how can you trust these fellows? They have done the wrong thing and they'll continue to do the wrong thing. There's no incentive. And sure enough, what happens is that all the bankers, they went on a spree, they gave themselves huge, big salary raises, and in fact, everything went away. So you were just traveling down the same path again. So basically, it's all about trust and it's all about incentives for doing the correct thing. So basically, that is what is at stake. Yeah.
On the PP curve, we can compare two equilibrium, that is which one is socially desirable. So can we bring time factor in this case, because there is a time problem, because from one equilibrium to another equilibrium may vary from society to society.
No, I mean, that would, it's not a question of going from one equilibrium to another. I'm just talking about what is going to happen at one equilibrium, right? If I want to talk about going from one equilibrium to another, that's a different question altogether, right? It's a question of whether or not there are market forces which would generate and push it towards the equilibrium. That's a separate thing. Don't get me talking about it, because that is one which I have worked for most of my life, and then I can bore you to death. So don't get me talking about that. So it's not about traveling from one position of equilibrium to another, not today. See, because that's a different class of problems.
Here it's just a comparison.
It is what is happening. Now, I was just telling them about the public good thing that I didn't notice when you came in. So,
Can I just say something?
Yeah. Just 1 minute. Professor Bhaduri wants to say something.
No, it's not such. But I think this is something which is of great interest.
It's on.
Great interest to all of us. And you see it on the newspaper every day almost. You see, when you talk of a democracy, ideal democracy, what does it mean? It means one adult, one vote. Okay? It is 1-1, and it gives you a fairly accurate solution, something like the competitive equilibrium. Lots of individuals, lots of participants, nobody has special power, manipulative power, and you get some sort of a solution. Now think of actually a working democracy with very unequal distribution of income and so on. So you can manipulate. You can manipulate the votes with money, so on and so forth. And the equilibrium you get is a different one. Now what Anjan was trying to say, this is a much more picturesque example of two types of or inequality, two types of institutions entering and so on. What Anjan was saying, that the ideal competitive equilibrium or the ideal democracy of one adult, one vote will give you a kind of solution which would be the always, whether you are in socialism, capitalism, whatever economic system, whatever jargon you use, that is more or less the solution you will come to. Perfect equality, the equilibrium. The solution which you will get with unequal money power and distribution, inequality, what you are talking about, would of course be a different solution. And whether without doing, and now you think, whether without democracy you can get something better or worse.
Well, the answer to that would depend on very much is where you are in that unequal situation, whether you are on the top or at the bottom. If you are at the top, then of course nothing like it. You do much better than at a comparative equilibrium. That's you. But the system as a whole, I don't know. That depends on your tastes. Yeah.
Arguing like less of market and more of market. This is a long debate going on actually. And many people will say that it's like kind of all the time that market is not allowed to function in the terms of Oman that you described actually. That market was not allowed. These banks.
No, my point is somewhat different. My point is the market always functions.
No, I'm
but
questioning your argument. I have a simple point. In which direction you think the debate is going on? It's going towards more of market or less of market?
I mean, I don't understand. I mean, are you asking me what is happening in the world around us?
Yeah, means in a sense, you can always like kind of club market with computer creative destruction actually.
No, but now almost everything, and you see, I think the marketplace itself is being redefined. The marketplace is just my computer. When I sit down with my computer, that's my marketplace. I can buy things on the market on my computer. But it's the market nevertheless. You know, I mean, again, it's a bit of semantics. As Bhaduri was mentioning, whether this is the market or that is the market. If you think of a market as a place where there are lots of people shouting, raving, yeah, well, that's our traditional marketplace. But here in my quiet, in my study, I'm buying and there's someone selling, right? There are all these crazy sites now where you can put things up. I mean, they work. I don't know, have you ever sold anything on one of these sites? What are they called, Quicker or something? Have any of you sold?
But when the banks were, sorry to interrupt you, but I didn't get you. When the banks were not allowed to basically kind of go bankrupt, imagine one of the bank, like Lehman or many banks were not allowed to go bankrupt. What do you say that? It was market that was allowed to function or market that was not allowed to function?
Oh, that question you are asking.
And in which direction this debate is going on actually?
No, you see, the market was not allowed to function in that case, because you see, what was happening was that the thing is, you see, right now, for instance, the stock market crash that you got at the time of the Great Depression will never happen today. Why not? Because any time that the thing falls by a certain within or beyond a certain limit, the stock market closes down. So once the stock market closes down, everyone knows it. So they'll never push it down below it, because everyone wants the stock market to operate, because everyone wants to make a buck. So the market fails to function. Question that you ought to be asking is whether it's a good thing that the market failed to function or a bad thing. And to that, it's a difficult question to answer. And if you had let the market function, what would have happened? The bank would have just gone. So what would that meant? Well, who would have lost out on that? Well, I don't know who were the main people who were the stockholders of the bank. I think that they should have lost out. Yeah, maybe. Well, that's a different question. It's not a question. But you see, the markets were made to function in such a way only because at that point in time, no one believed what was going to happen. So everyone was selling that you can't provide me with anything in value. So I just want to get rid of it. So the quality of whatever they were selling was just bad. So no one wanted to buy. So that was a good decision. Okay, I mean that, but they were not punished, you see. I mean, the entire thing is that the same situation would happen again. What Robert Owen said.
How to bring the kind of silo kind of deterrent much into this kind of deterrent in the market actually?
Well, in a way you can't, you see, because this has kept on happening over and over again. It's not as if these kinds of crashes happen only once. Fortunately, they don't happen often, but they happen pretty regularly. So I think it's basically, it has to do with that it's only when everyone decides that we want. See, when the thing starts plummeting, it means that a whole lot of people are willing to sell and there's no one willing to buy. Why do people want to sell? Because it's just a bad thing, so you want to get rid of it. Right? That's why the price falls. There can't be a great demand. Had there been a great demand for its stocks and shares, then of course the price would have just risen. So I think in some sense, when people lose the faith in the product, that's when this kind of thing happens. And if it is something very special, then clearly that is what is at stake. That is what goes wrong. That's when things happen. You lose out.
People will try to bring deterrence in the market-based model, where people will basically afraid of taking serious risk-taking positions.
They would be.
The moral hazard problem can be countered with a kind of deterrent action.
No, you see, moral hazard, you have to tell people that, look, you must behave properly and with some amount of responsibility. What else can you do?
So suppose the government declares priority, you make any risk.
Ajay, but tell me something. I don't know. I seem to be getting phone calls almost every day and more than once from various financial agencies saying that we'll arrange for a loan, no papers are required, 5 lakhs. So I say no. Now, you see, what is happening? It's the same thing that is happening. You're giving out loans to people who, without any restriction on whether or not the person is able to pay back or not. So what will happen? Things that have happened before. We have not managed to stop it. See, the incentives, so long as their incentive is that the number of loans you issued, you get a markup on your salary for that. How much loans have you got? So if that happens, then this is what will happen. I ask them that, look, do you want the money back at some stage? Then I am not interested. If you give it to me, I may want it. But
So this kind of compensation structure was typically, it worked fine for issuance of equity. So people who were brokering the issuance of equity in the markets, this kind of compensation works fine for them. That, okay, if I'm able to get your equity sold for 100 crore rupees, I take a 5% cut on that. But when you get debt issued like that, then it leads to a lot of problems. So I think it builds upon his question that if I tie the compensation to the way loans get paid back, so if I issue a 5-year debt.
If you can devise things which are incentive compatible, then it should work. But whether you can devise things which are incentive compatible, that is the question, right? If you can devise something, so all that I'm saying is that, look, I mean, incentive compatibility is a must, because otherwise they'll start doing the wrong things. I mean, they will seek out what is best for them. Or had they been taught that there is something about good moral behavior, which Sen talked about. So it's morally right to do this, right? I mean, I don't know about anything about Islamic banking, for example. No rate of interest. How does it? I have no idea. But they believe that this is the way that banking should work. If they all believe, then that's the way it will work. It's a matter of belief. The question is whether that works or not.
I want to understand that is there a possibility that over the time the public nature of a good will diminish and this good will become a private good? Because we keep on talking about market failure versus government failure. And we say that over the time period subsidies should be decreased or the government should be held less responsible for, say, social welfare. So can we say that over the time period the public nature will come down and the good will become, each and every type of good or service will become a private good or service?
I don't know.
As a universal proposition, maybe.
That is unlikely. That's unlikely. I mean, why should publicness be decreased over time?
Like we are talking about education,
Yes.
health, all these services.
No, but you see, I think the point is that publicness by itself cannot diminish, you see. See, look, there are two things. Whether it's available for joint consumption. If it is available for joint consumption, it remains public. If you cannot exclude, it remains public. So these things, why should just time erode these properties? I don't see why time would erode any of these properties. You see, I don't see, you have to remember, you see, stick to definitions and then ask yourself the question whether it makes sense to think of the time as something which would be a factor. I think not. Time may come in a different way. Suppose, you know, I mean, for instance, education, suppose, you know, literacy is 100%. Everyone knows how to read, write. Everyone is in school. But still you need to keep on having schools because there are children being born, send them to school. The minute you restrict and don't have government support, then the schools would be reduced, or unless you have a decreasing population over time of schools. I mean, that's frightful actually. I don't know whether you've seen, in some countries, I have seen schools perfectly, this is in Japan, you know, beautiful schools, elementary schools. There are no children. There are only 6 children in that school. The neighborhood school, nevertheless, but there were so many children living there. Now they don't have children, you see. So what do? Now in such situations, but still the government spends enormous sums on education, both school as well as higher education. In fact, the expenditure, I mean, being a professor in a Japanese national university means substantial benefits in terms of research time and support, enormous. And I remember when they started off doing it, because everyone was getting at least an equivalent to their salary. The salaries are not as high as in the US, for example, but about 3/4 of your salary in the US, certainly, and an almost equal amount for your own research. And you would have noticed what has happened in the last few years about the list of Nobel laureates that you see. The number of Japanese in the sciences have gone up tremendously. So that is the effect of government support. It's only when you, as I said in the beginning, that you keep on supporting like man, you build up more institutions like this, have more such winter schools and summer schools, maybe someone would come out of it who would change the way we think.
My question is about the rating thing. So nowadays, for online shopping companies, do what for a particular product, they take the public reviews and ratings. Like if I buy some good, then I can give my ratings and reviews. So do you think that's a good way of having ratings, because the companies don't have to pay the agencies or?
No, you see, ratings are good things, but how do you do the ratings? I mean, I can't quite say what is a good way. I have not thought about this. But I think in some sense, ratings can also be fudged, you see. I mean, so any rule can be fudged, provided there is no incentive to do so.
So can we break for lunch now?
Yeah.
Maybe.
I would, but I don't know what you want.
We can carry. So let's.
Thank you.
So I mean, we have one of the reasons why we have a sufficiently long lunch break is that after lunch you can have time for discussions and you can have questions with the professor.
Okay. Are there further discussions for this? No, I think that not today, but tomorrow.